Hello and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the third event in our series on assessments brought to you by Assessment HQ, a project of the Collaborative for Student Success. Before I hand it over to our moderator, Dale Chu, just a couple housekeeping issues for folks that may not be as familiar with WebEx as a platform. In your upper right-hand corner, you will see a few different views. This will allow you to select how you would like to view our panelists. In your lower right-hand corner, you will see your mute, the video, as well as a chat or ellipses. As a note, for the purpose of our event, please use the chat functionality for any technical issues you may be having that we can help solve for. And the ellipses is a wonderful way to ask questions of our panelists. You have been muted and your video has been turned off upon entry, so please do add in questions into that Q&A function. With that, I'm happy to hand it over to Dale Chu.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dale Chu, and I, among other things, I blog for Assessment HQ, and I'm delighted to have this esteemed panel here this afternoon. I think it's going to be a great conversation. We have Denise Fort from the Ed Trust, Senior Vice President for Partnerships and Engagement, Lynn Olson, who's a Senior Fellow with Future Ed, and Governor Jack Markell, the former governor of the state of Delaware. And those of you who may have joined one of our previous two discussions will recall that the first one we had a couple of weeks ago was focused on the importance of measurement, very high level. Last week, we sort of focused on this fall in terms of how that might look like. And then today, we're going to wrap things up by looking at arguably one of the most juiciest topics, which is what happens in the spring with testing, given all the things that are up in the air. Without belaboring the point, assuming most folks on the call sort of tracking this at some level, but as a quick refresher, 2 weeks ago, the state of Georgia signaled its intent to submit a waiver, which would make it the second consecutive year for state testing. And then, not to be outdone, 2 days later, South Carolina made a similar announcement. And sort of in the interim, we've also seen rumblings in other states such as Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Michigan from different folks that are also for a waiver for state testing. As I understand it, no formal waivers have actually been submitted to the United States Department of Education at this point, but one doesn't really sort of need to be a meteorologist to sort of get a sense of where the wind is blowing. Those of you may familiar with Lynn's work. She had a big report on this topic recently called The Big Test with Future Ed, which I think will also provide a great foundation for the discussion we're going to have this afternoon. So let's get into this, right? I mean, we know sort of the assessment landscape now, sort of post-COVID, but why don't we start with sort of before COVID-19? How was all of this shaking out? Let's start with Lynn, but then I would love for Governor Markell and also for Denise to jump in as well.
Yeah, so even before COVID, we were seeing a lot of churn and increasing fragmentation in state testing systems. As you know, we'd gone from a period when many states had indicated they were going to use tests developed by one of two state testing consortia aligned with college and career ready standards. That fell apart. And in grades 3 through 8, we've seen an increasing number of states go back to developing their own tests. And at the high school level, more and more states adopting college admissions tests, either the SAT or the ACT, as their high school assessment for federal accountability purposes. So we were already at a point where there was a lot of churn, increasing fragmentation, and efforts in state legislatures by both Democrats and Republicans to address in various ways what they saw as concerns about overtesting.
Denise, Governor, want to jump in on that?
Well, I think Lynn should be a diplomat. I think churn and fragmentation is a very nice way to put it. You're absolutely right, and frankly, for understandable reasons. I mean, I do, over testing is a problem. That being said, they're doing, and the right assessments can be very valuable to teachers to make sure that they're doing a great job with their kids. So actually, it's a few years ago now, but when I in my last year or so in office, we actually did an inventory of all the assessments in our state because we also thought that there was too much testing going on. So you want to strike the right balance, but I think this is sort of a fraught moment, and getting it right and taking a deep breath is really important.
I mean, I can remember really post No Child Left Behind, and the few years of implementation afterwards, quite the agitation in the community from a range of sources about the proliferation of testing. I don't necessarily think that has left. I think that there's a simmering of concern that's out there. You can, the opt-out movement is still certainly quite present in a number of states. But I think our challenge has been is how do you communicate the need for relevant testing in its purpose? How do you make sure that it is both used for the reason that it needs to be used for? But there is no doubt that I think that we see these waves out in the public about how testing is implemented, but we certainly have just not gotten the right handle about the framing yet or the narrative. And certainly, and I think we're seeing that right now with this rush to judgment from a lot of states about how they should handle the 2021 school year.
I think part of that. I'm sorry, Dale. Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, to Denise's point about the opt-out stuff that's going on. This question that I just got here, which I think is a good one, which, 4 years ago, whatnot, when you had New York and New Jersey sort of really pushing on this. But now, at least from, it's early days, but in terms of sort of the buzz we've had, it's been more southern states, right? Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee. What's your hypothesis in terms of sort of, in terms of the chomping of the bit coming from sort of a geographically different location?
Yeah, so when we did the analysis for the big tests, you're right, we looked at state legislation that was introduced between 2014 and 2019. And it certainly, there were far fewer bills introduced in 2019 than in 2014 at the height of the opt-out movement. But there is still activity. I think part of the reason you're seeing it more in the South now is that just like COVID, there was an early peak of activity in states like Massachusetts, New York, Illinois. It's not that that has gone away, but a number of states did take steps, just as Delaware did, to do testing audits or other measures to reduce testing time or the number of tests. And some of that has just come later to some of these southern states that are now grappling with those issues.
And I think part of the challenge is that not enough people get to see the most powerful moments when it comes to looking at what testing is telling us. And for me, the most powerful moments was when I would visit schools and I would visit teachers who were maybe 5 or 6 in a group and really going over what the data was telling them about student performance from some of these assessments. And when we got to see the teachers working with each other and sort of understanding what the data was telling them and talking about how they're going to adapt their strategies, it could be very powerful. So that was one powerful moment. The other powerful moment was when we only have 19 school districts in Delaware, but when I got to see our superintendents meeting with each other and sharing ideas and sharing strategies and looking at the data. And if one district is having particular success with a similar group of students as, where other districts are falling short, to the extent that people can go into that conversation not being defensive and really understanding, again, what the data is telling them and how can we learn from each other, it can be really a great moment. And unfortunately, I think just too many people don't have access and don't get to see those kinds of moments as they take place.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember how we got here in the first place. the reason we have the state testing systems we have right now were because of concerns that students of color, low-income students, English language learners were not getting access to the same expectations, the same high-quality content as other students, and that we actually needed to have comparable, accurate data to try to address those inequities. And while assessments need to improve, I think one thing we've witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic and school closures is that those inequities are very much still with us.
Denise, you want to add to that?
Oh, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. What we're seeing now, and parents are acknowledging this too. Ed Trust has done a number of polls of surveys of parents, and the breakdown when you look at white parents, black parents, Latino parents, it's very clear that communities of color do not feel like they've had the same access when it comes to remote learning. They do not feel that the engagement has been at the same level. And so when you look at the data now versus data in the past, it's sort of, you can see the same storylines, right? Communities of color not having access to high quality teachers, communities of color not having access to advanced curriculum, communities of color not having access to high quality pre-K programs. It's the same, all of that, yet in a COVID world where whether it's remote learning, access to rigorous curriculum, hotspots, teacher engagement, quality of engagement, it's all still there. But what I think is probably more important is that parents, regardless of color and income level, want to know how their students are performing, but also how the system is performing, right? Mm-hmm. And when we talk about end of year testing, that's really what we're getting at. How do parents and policymakers understand how the system is reaching students across the spectrum, students of color, low income kids, EL students, students with disability. And when you are trying to deal with what we are clearly seeing now, and we call it the dual public health crisis of both COVID and racism, if you're going to attack some of these systems and systemic racism, systemic health issues, you need a systemic view in order to deal with it. And that is what these end of the year assessments allow you to do, to look at the entire system and figure out whether it is serving all kids in the way it needs to. So yeah, this is absolutely definitely impacting communities of color differently, which is why the feds got involved over 60 years ago, and why most education laws are civil rights laws.
So let me piggyback off of that. And I think we bring a great point. Some of the equity issues, that are involved. Some of the race issues here. I mean, I think we're all old enough to remember. It wasn't that long ago when folks sort of understood, some of the guardrails provided by assessment, the information that's provided, and yet the winds have changed now, right? And I'd like to start with Governor, with you on this. I mean, those of you who are watching here, you can't see sort of Governor Markell's back, but there's tire treads sort of on there, and I'd love to sort of get your take in terms of why the shift that we're seeing now.
Well, it's a very easy thing for people to understand. And too much testing, it's sort of it becomes a truism, regardless of what's actually going on. But unfortunately, in many places, there really is too much testing. And so it's one of these things that if sometimes people would rather not get into the nuance and say, all right, we're gonna be very thoughtful. We're gonna take a hard look at what testing is actually adding value, because I think we could all agree that over a period of time, a lot of tests came about that didn't provide particular value to the educators themselves. And it's absolutely essential. I mean, any of these tests should be very helpful to teachers in terms of making sure that they can adjust what they're doing in the classroom, and should be very helpful to parents so that they know how their kids are doing. and it should be and it should be helpful to the public at large, so they can say this district seems to be doing well, this district similar population of kids doing differently. And so I think, it's just one of these arguments that took on a life of its own. And so I think the more thoughtful that we can be, and I think the timing of this is really important. I mean, this particular moment is a moment where we've got to be careful, because we've got to be sensitive to the incredible challenges that so many of our kids and their families and the educators who are trying to teach while they've got their own kids running around at home. This is a really difficult moment. We have to be really, really sensitive to that, but we also have to keep our eye on the longer term as well.
So let's say, I'd like to get Lynn and Denise's thoughts on this. Let's say, thinking pessimistically here, let's say the Department of Education starts granting these waivers sooner rather than later. What's the impact if that starts happening?
Well, go ahead, Lynn. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Denise.
I was just going to jump in and say, our greatest concern is that if recognizing that school systems are struggling right now and will continue to struggle, parents and students have gone through amazing challenges health-wise, the economy, but let's not lose the sight of that we will already have lost a year's worth of data. And if we continue to go without another year's worth of data, it becomes very simple, I think, for a lot of policymakers to say, well, we don't need that at all. That's to fall back to the time where we didn't have credible information about how schools were doing and how the system was doing. You can't, again, you don't have to go too far back in the history books to remember a time when we didn't have good data about school discipline, the availability of school counselors, how students were accessing coursework, which has led to really fundamental policy changes. And if we were to go another year without this really relevant data, and I'm not arguing for, using it for accountability purposes. I'm really talking right now about public reporting, which is probably the most critical thing that we could have right now. To lose that public reporting on how the system is adequately or inadequately serving all kids would be, I think, do a real damage to not just public education, but the education of kids. We need to make this happen.
Yeah, I want to build on what Denise said, because I think it's important right now to separate public reporting of state test results from accountability decisions this coming year. I do think it's important, if at all possible, to give state tests this spring and to publicly report that information so we don't have another year of missing data. I don't think those results should be used for accountability decisions for students and teachers in schools, given how unusual the past spring was, how uncertain and different this coming school year will be. It's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to attribute changes in those scores to actions taken by educators in schools. And their attention, rightly this fall, has to be on those close-in assessments that really help them get all kids to grade level instruction. And that students' social, emotional, and academic health as we start the school year, as the governor noted, has really got to be a priority.
I totally agree on this accountability versus transparency issue. I mean, because let's face it, even in the best of times, we have struggled to get the accountability piece right. And so of all times for us to take a step back and say, we're really going to focus on making sure that the system, gets back on track, and we're not going to put that added pressure on. I think this is the right moment for that attitude.
Can I ask, and I'm actually sort of nodding my head listening to all three of you talk, and I feel like folks who tend to be supportive of annual testing sort of fall into this idea of sort of decoupling accountability from assessment. It just strikes me, at least from a policy standpoint, that makes sense. But from a political standpoint, I mean, is that even possible? I mean, again, if I look at the the facsimile of the world that is represented by social media and Twitter. When you sort of look at folks in terms of how they respond to Georgia and South Carolina, they're like, yes, this is great. Get rid of, A through F systems. The sort of the response is on the accountability side, as if the two are essentially synonymous. I mean, is it possible to sort of separate it the way you guys are describing?
I think it absolutely is, because I think the pressure is on the accountability side. I mean, I think most people would agree that the ideal state is for assessments to provide particular value to teachers so they can adjust what they're doing in the classroom, and to provide needed information to families and to the, and to the district leadership and the like. So I think that would make it, I think, significantly easier to win that argument.
And Dale, just, going back to a point that was made earlier, when you look at surveys, teachers and parents want information, and surveys of teachers have found they want to know how their kids do over the course of the year. They would like data throughout the year, not just at the end of the year. They'd like that data to be more actionable for classrooms. Many of the existing score reports are not produced with parents in mind. They're not clear and actionable and understandable by parents. So there's a lot we could do to improve the way we even report test information in a way that is more understandable by parents and educators themselves.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There is no doubt we can improve in a variety of places when it comes to assessments. Like everybody who talks about this, I mean, anybody who sort of has conversations about testing, I think we can agree with that. We do have to do also a better job on framing, honestly, to help folks understand why we need the information and the value of the information that is out there. It is certainly when you get caught up into, even my own child who, I had to do an hour of park today and I have to do it for 3 weeks. If you get caught up into that, which also has its merits, we should be thinking different ways about how to deploy and implement the assessment. But if we can navigate to a place where what is the value of the data, what is the value that you take home, what is the value of having schools put this on the report card so that there's a tremendous, both, again, policy value, but also just consumer value as a parent and as a teacher about the system that we all contribute to. But it really needs a concerted framing effort, and we have not been able to do that well.
I'm hearing you, all three of you, loud and clear on the data piece. That sort of essentially, essential piece of what's provided with assessments. And I should also say, as a quick sidebar, to folks who are tuned in right now, if you have questions for the panel, you should feel free at this point to throw those into the Q&A box, and we'll endeavor to get to those. But anyways, going back to the data, let's sort of take a half step back from 2021 in terms of whether we'll lose that assessment data or not. We already have lost 2020, right? We lost that 1 year. So can we talk a little bit about how does that impact some of the data pieces you're talking about? Denise, you talked about the state report cards. Lynn, you talked about what parents wanted. I mean, growth, I think, is something that parents have expressed interest in. But talk a little bit about sort of this idea. We've already lost 1 year of data. What are the implications that we already have right now?
I mean, go ahead, Lynn. I'm gonna let you go this time.
I was going to say, one thing is to look at other sources of data as well. So there is a lot of data, including data on attendance, engagement, participation with distance learning that we haven't done a very good job of collecting and sharing. That needs to get much better. There are other assessment results from interim assessments and other sources that are not routinely shared, sometimes even with teachers, let alone parents, on a timely basis. That needs to get better. I think you can look at the data from 2019 and already know a lot about which schools and which students may be likely to need additional assistance. Schools don't go in and out of school improvement overnight. And so there is data we can act on, and we can certainly look at changes in test scores from 2019 to spring 2021, assuming that the tests are given in spring 2021. We just need to be really careful and cautious about how we attribute changes between those two periods.
I have a question here. I'm actually going to read it verbatim because I actually feel like it reflects folks who have been frustrated, I think, with testing over the last few years. And the question is, what is the evidence that 2 decades of test and punish reform policies have either improved overall academic achievement or helped narrow gaps between demographic groups on the basis of race or socioeconomic status?
Well, I don't know if I want to buy into that framing either in response to the question of test and punish. Look, I think that as I started out in the beginning, we all agree that a variety of assessments can be improved. But the fact of the matter is that before we did regular testing 3 through 8, we did not know how well or how poorly schools of color, children of color, or low-income kids, or kids with disabilities, or ELs were doing. That is fundamental. And if we are going to push for an equity agenda that serves all kids well, you have to know, as a policymaker, you would want to know, as a parent, how schools are going to narrow the achievement gap and serve your children. So we have seen there are definite bright spots. Please go to our website and look at our, as well as check out Karen Chenoweth's Extraordinary Districts podcast. There are tremendous bright spots of low-income communities, kids of color, that are just flourishing, and they are flourishing because the system was able to provide data to direct resources where they needed to direct them to, was able to make sure that teachers were serving the kids well and knew how to, were in the classroom to teach. So again, not going to buy into the test and punish narrative, but I'll certainly say there are areas, Governor Markell can probably speak to this as well, but I'm not going to buy into the narrative that nothing is working.
So I think I agree with Denise, and I think the framing of the question of test and punish, I think unfortunately, that framing does reflect how a lot of people think the last many years have gone down, and that is really, and to some extent, I think that framing has probably been justified in some places. So I think what we've got to do is we've got to move to this point where, first of all, recognizing that we would literally have no idea how kids of color, or for that matter, are doing without the kind of assessments that we have seen. That's number one. And number two, we've just got to do a much better job of making this about helping the teacher as opposed to the teacher feeling like they're being punished. And I'll give you a specific example. We spent a bunch of time while I was governor focused on teacher assessment, teacher accountability. And there were plenty of schools where the principals had to tell the teachers in advance that they would be going into the classroom to assess their teaching, and it became a very negative experience. It might happen once or twice a year. We had other schools where the principals would be going in, every week, every other week, be short visits, and really offering, very constructive, tweaks to how the teachers were performing and how the teachers were teaching. And my experience is that the teachers really like that. They don't want to be in this place where it feels incredibly antagonistic. They do want to be in a place, teachers are professionals, and they want to be in a place where they're getting professional advice about how to improve their teaching. So I think we've got to continue to do better to make sure we're not letting up, that we are assessing, but we're making the assessments more valuable to everybody in the process.
So you got another question from the audience. It says, I have heard suggestions that any summative tests administered in spring 2021 should be shortened to try to reflect learning loss / opportunity to learn. This sounds like a terrible idea to me. We need to know how students are doing against grade level expectations, and those expectations have not changed. What do our panelists think about this idea? Will it gain traction or will it die? I hope the latter.
I don't have a crystal ball. I think there have been some suggestions that if students are in school for less time, do you need to spend less time on end of year tests, or do those tests need to focus more on high priority content standards if schools don't have time to cover all the standards of the year? I don't think we know the answer to that right now. I do think states need to be thinking now about how to give state tests under comparable conditions, and that will be challenging, will take some advanced planning. So there are legitimate questions about what state test administration will look like this spring, but now is probably the time for states to start thinking about that.
Other thoughts, Governor Denise?
I agree with Lynn.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the fact, I think that hasn't been talked about as much on this topic with the remaining time we have, around the fact that for the most part, states have already inked testing contracts, right, with vendors, right? And when you look at, I'll just pick on Tennessee because they're one of the states that had some of this discussion. They went to paper and pencil, and because of the shuttering of schools, essentially all their tests are in a warehouse now, and they're being held for future use. And again, I think a lot of the sort of negotiations or unscrambling of sort of these contracts from losing these tests in 2020 are happening sort of behind the scenes. But you could sort of assume that these aren't happy conversations for both sides. And you talk a little bit about like sort of if the feds were to give a waivers in 2021, like how does that impact the sort of the testing contract situation that states are in? Maybe Lynn, I'll go with you on this one first.
Yeah, the testing contract situation is complicated, and I think it's going to take a while to work out because some of these contracts are vague. It could end up in litigation. I don't think you'll get an overnight solution to what happens to those contracts. And I think states are making decisions now about how to support closer in assessments and interim assessments in the fall that they'll have to make even as those contracts are in play. Future Ed has 2 other reports coming out in the next couple of weeks. One really looking not only at state testing, but also at closer in assessments for instruction, and one looking at changes in the testing industry as a result of all this churn that's been going on even before COVID. So that piece in particular will look a little more at what's happening on the testing industry side of the equation. I should also note that the Center on Reinventing Public Education has a statement coming out tomorrow from a panel of experts with some principles about how to think about assessments for the fall, really geared toward instruction and toward supporting classroom learning.
I just echo everything Lynn said, and would just add that they most likely will have to look different. I mean, it's different from just like we are reorganizing how education is being carried out right now. Everything from how you deal with proctors to what it looks like when someone's being tested in a different learning environment. But hopefully vendors are thinking really intentionally about that with their states. Each state has a different type of contract, and so it will be state by state, but hopefully states are, digging in right now to think about how they will deliver on providing this very critical information to parents and policymakers for next year.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think if there's ever been a moment for the vendors to be creative, to be thinking through how they really partner with the states in advancing these students' education, and not thinking just about it financially. I'm not being disrespectful. I'm just saying, you know, sometimes it can feel like there are just so many people trying to, you know, feed from the public education system. We are in such a difficult moment that I'm hoping that people will really come together to figure out how to partner most effectively.
All right, we're coming close to the end of the festivities, but I would love to be able to. We've covered a lot of ground here. Thanks to each of you for your insights, from the politics, the policy, to sort of the brass tacks of what vendors are doing, what states and district leaders should be doing. A lot of stuff. But if you were to sort of share, I want to hear from each of you on this, sort of your parting words or parting advice to states and districts in light of the fact that here we are in July, or almost July, 10 months out before spring 2021 testing, and there's already this buzz about waivers. What words would you want to impart? Would you want to leave with those folks who are listening in? And why don't we start with we'll start with Denise, and then we'll go to Governor Markell, and then we'll go to Lynn, sort of like the reverse of how we started.
Thanks, Dale. Thank you for this conversation. It has been great, and I've really enjoyed it. It's always a pleasure, certainly, to be with the governor and with Lynn and with you folks. So thank you for that. Look, we are certainly at another point in our history where we're facing multiple challenges at once, and our biggest concern is that we keep things focused on students. We keep things focused on how we narrow and address achievement gaps and opportunity gaps. And certainly we know that tests alone are not going to address those gaps, but they are absolutely foundational to pushing for and achieving educational equity for all students. We certainly believe that more information is always going to be better than less information. And we think that's been borne out from surveys of parents and teachers. Hopefully, as schools do start to find their way through this, and we are with them and wanting to help them find their way through this, that they don't throw out what is one of the most core civil rights opportunities to narrow these gaps, and that the bottom line is really to get the information we need so that all students can achieve.
So first of all, Dale, thanks very much. And Denise and Lynn, great to be with the two of you as well. And I want to thank the collaborative also for putting this together. I never thought I would be nostalgic for the depths of the Great Recession, particularly 2009, 2010. But I have to say, when I think about what the policymakers of today are facing, the challenges are extraordinary, because they, in addition, we haven't really even talked about the fact that all of these states are facing significant budget challenges, and that we can't sort of say, okay, we're going to put that to the side. I mean, that's sort of part and parcel of this whole conversation. But in addition to that, we just know how difficult this moment in time is for our students and their families and all of the folks, the teachers and everybody else in the schools. And we have to be very sensitive to that. But at the same time, we also know how important honesty is to those same people, to our students, to their parents, to the schools, in terms of honesty about student assessment and how they are all doing. And so trying to find that balance is really one of the most important issues of our time. I think there's going to be some fits and starts with it. But I think that's why we really have to try to make this not a political debate, not a partisan debate, but really putting all of our best minds together to say, how do we meet this incredibly difficult moment from the budget perspective, from just what all these folks are going through in their own lives, and the need to be honest to make sure that these students are making the kind of progress that we all want them to make.
Yeah, I really want to thank everyone on this conversation. I think we do need a more balanced assessment and accountability system where we're using the right assessments for the right purposes. But I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that a failure to collect data and ignoring data doesn't make a challenge go away. And now more than ever, we need good data about how our students are doing socially, emotionally, and academically in order to make sure that they're learning and they can thrive.
Well, on that note, I think it's a great note to close on. I want to thank Denise, Lynn, Governor Markell, all three of you for your insights and your expertise this afternoon. I mean, I selfishly, I found it to be a super enjoyable and eye-opening conversation. And especially, the timing couldn't have been better given the fact, sort of what's happening in the country. And we'll all, I know, we'll be sort of keeping our eyes on this going forward. So to everyone who came and joined us this afternoon, thank you so much for attending. The video, as well as a write-up on each of the sessions, are available. You see the website on your screen, forstudentsuccess.org. And if you're interested in following some of the work that the Collaborative is doing at Assessment HQ, where yours truly blogs about these issues, but we also track sort of happenings across the country, you can go to assessmenthq.org, where you'll find more information than you know what to do with regard to this topic. But again, thank you so much to all the folks who tuned in today, and thank you again to our panelists for joining us and taking the time to stop on by. So again, thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.